Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin in 1 minute. Please welcome the Atlantic's Emily Lenzner.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Emily Lenzner. I'm the Senior Vice President of Communications for Atlantic Media, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today to And Justice for All, the Impact of Incarceration in America. And it's so good to see so many of you here bright and early. There's such a wealth of knowledge just in this room, policy experts, congressional staffers, activists, and journalists. So one of the topics we're going to address today is the First Step Act. After receiving bipartisan support and being signed into law by President Trump, many are probably wondering what happens next. Even with this reform bill, more than 6.5 million people are in U.S. prisons and jails, on probation or on parole. In any given year, the U.S. spends about $80 billion on just locking people up. When 1 out of every 38 people is entangled in the criminal justice system, the impact is felt everywhere. By families, partners, kids, parents, by our communities, especially those struggling on the margins. And policymakers are just beginning to examine the fallout and what needs to change, if anything. And that's what we're going to explore this morning through a wide range of perspectives from around the country. We'll hear from reform advocates from Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, Florida, New York, and from those concerned about the direction that reform has taken. We'll hear from the formerly incarcerated, including Matthew Charles, the first person released under this new law. We'll hear from families, and you'll also have a chance to join the conversation when we open it up to questions after each panel. But before we begin, I want to thank Forward.us because without them and their support, this gathering would not be possible. So one last practical note. Please silence your cell phones, but keep them close because we're on Twitter at AtlanticLIVE, and we'd love to have you join the conversation. The hashtag is AtlanticJustice, no spaces. And with that, let's begin. We're going to start with a reminder of why we're here and why this all matters. How a son's life with an imprisoned father led him to push for change. So please welcome Tony Lewis Jr. He's a lifelong DC resident and the author of Slug, A Boy's Life in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And he's joined by Matt Thompson, contributing editor at The Atlantic. Matt?
Thank you so much, Emily. And thanks to all of you this morning for joining us. Tony, your book, Slug, is called Slug, A Boy's Life in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Thought it was a resonant moment. I want to stick on, throughout this morning, we're going to talk with a lot of folks about all of the aspects of us as Americans growing up around this system that we built. But a boy's life. For this conversation, I kind of want to stick in that moment right there. So, you started where you came up originally as a young kid. You describe yourself as pampered. You were a young kid growing up. Talk a little bit about your early life, and then talk about the moment when everything changed.
Yeah, well, I grew up on Hanover Place, which is maybe 5 blocks from where we are right now. And at that time, my community, my street was the epicenter of the cocaine trade. My father was a major participant in that both of my parents grew up on Hanover Place. And so at the time of my birth, 1980, powder cocaine was a thing, and my street was the place that people in Washington came to get that. So with that, the money that my father made from that really provided a certain lifestyle for us, much different from what my parents experienced growing up, and much different from what the other people in my community experienced. So yeah, we did a lot of things that people with affluence do. Like we traveled, we shopped, we enjoyed life, we spent a lot of quality time together. So and then in 1989, my father would go to prison and be charged for his role in a major conspiracy here in D.C. and receive life without the possibility of parole. And so life took a big 180 for me and my mother. So we went from being very affluent to being just like everybody else very quickly. And what also came along with that, obviously, I talked about the time we spent. My dad was a very hands-on father, so I lost that. And the stress and the pressure of that situation for my mother, it really crumbled her. And so essentially I lost my parents in the way that I had them prior to his incarceration. My mother would up until this day really battle with mental illness, and so for me as a 9-year-old, my innocence was stripped. My sense of security was stripped, and I had to grow up pretty fast. The other part of that was that their trial was major and it was everywhere, and one of the things that I'll never forget is my dad was at D.C. jail, but it was claims that they were getting preferential treatment. So they went from D.C. jail to Quantico Marine Base, right? And so to visit someone at a Marine base, and Marines are there, right? M16s. But the other thing was that if there's no visiting hall, you have to go to the cell to actually visit. So to really, as a 9-year-old, to see your father on the other side of the bars in a very literal way was something that, is always etched in my memory. But those experiences and that trauma started, pretty much on April 15th, 1989.
That was such the journey that started at that point had to be, so complex. You were at once, I just imagine the range of emotions that you must have gone through. Because you write in your book, you said that you had, you saw the open air drug market on Hanover. You went, you hung out there, and you had a sense of what was happening a little bit. You would call out Olore. Talk about that.
So Olore was a code word for the police. And so you would see the adults or the teenagers saying that to give a cue that the police were coming. And when I was younger, the police didn't really come to our street like one car. Like they would come in force. But obviously, the more heads up you can give people, the more people can, do what they need to do to avoid being arrested. And so as a child, you just felt like you wanted to contribute to that. You saw the police as they were bad. Right, you didn't understand that crime was going on. It was our norm. It was what happened in our community, and we wanted to protect the people that we love. We saw the police as people that came to take away the people that we cared about. And so, if any, from the age of 3, 4, if you felt like you wanted to play a part in protecting those that you cared about, and so you, as a young man, a young boy, I would definitely say Olore when I saw the police.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were protecting your dad and his friends and those folks around you. At the same time, he was protecting you. And I want to ask you about how you, both as a kid and now as an adult, came to understand the choices that your father made. Because one of the things that you stress was that from the moment you were enlightened as to how your father made his business, from the moment you learned that, he was consistent on that he did not want that life for you. He did not want his life for you, and that the choices that he'd made in part to protect you from having to live that life and to have the consequence that befell him.
Yeah.
But that was complicated. That's a complicated message to give to a kid. How did you come to understand your father and his choices? When he was telling you, I did this so you wouldn't have to, how legitimate did you come to find that?
Yeah, like, that's a great point because, the understanding of what he did came, like, again, we growing up, we seeing people, doing things that we don't fully understand, but, I knew my dad didn't have a job, right? I did know that growing up. But as I became more aware of, him being a drug dealer and when he went to prison, and his explanation of why he made those choices to try to make a better life for me and him growing up, he didn't have a dad. Him growing up in an apartment on Hanover with 6 siblings and, not enough to eat, literally, right? And explaining that to me why he started to make the choices to get involved in the lifestyle that was outside of our home. But after he went to prison, I was right back on that same block with all of those, and really in a worse time, honestly. Because once they went to prison, DC got even more violent. But the drugs, that culture was very present, right, in the 90s in DC.
So your dad is telling you, don't hang out with your friends.
Don't go out. Basically, he was saying, don't go outside. Like, I know a lot of times he felt that he was in prison. Obviously, he was very accountable that he broke the law. But in terms of these conspiracy and how their trial played out, was that most of the stuff that was mentioned in the trial had nothing to do with him. Yeah. And so he understood how guilty by association was a real thing. And so he wanted me, he never glorified what he did. He never justified what he did. He really felt like he was trying to do that to pivot somehow into another, some legal stuff, right? He wanted me, that's why education for him and my mother was so important for me. And he would always call and say, Slug, watch who you're around. Slug, don't get into nothing. I never wanted, he was very transparent also about what goes on in prison, right? And what happens there, why he would never, prison was for, in his words, this is not for any human being, right? So the last place he would want to see his son was there. And I appreciated, those conversations, though at the time, it was like, well, who do I hang out with, though? Because I didn't know anybody else. We didn't know anybody else, from the adults in my life, especially the males, to my peers. People were involved in the same lifestyle that he led. And so that became a struggle for me to navigate through that in my community. But I always had him as a motivator and an advisor to do the right thing. The older I got, though, it got more difficult to do that without any role models.
Yeah. He called you Slug. Who was Slug?
Yeah, so Slug, when I was younger, like 2, 3 years old, they would kind of put like the boxing gloves on us and and so I would, in 4 years old, 5 years old, I would like to, not fight, but like box, Sugar Ray Leonard was an idol of ours growing up. And so, the name Slug it was Slugger at first. And then you know how the hood would do, and it turned into Slug, know. So everybody who knows and loves me calls me Slug. And that was why I wanted to, entitle the book that, right? Because that's who I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I ask you these questions, this great crowd that we've assembled here, filled with folks who do policy and write strong news stories and what have you, and they're probably wondering, why are we talking about this biography? I could read the book, which you should.
Sure, you really should.
But the work that you do now as an adult is in part with kids who are going through versions of what you went through as a kid. You mentor young folks who are surrounded by the system that we built. Sure. And how do you, in talking with them, how do you carry some of the messages that you carry, knowing the complications of those messages? How do you tell a kid, so watch out for your social circle and the friends that you surround yourself with?
I mean, I try to be transparent. That's also what Slug was about. I'm you, right? This is a map for you, trying to give you tools on how to be amongst your friends, but not necessarily make all the decisions that they make. Show them how they can be leaders. And for those of them that have leadership qualities already, established leadership qualities, how they can use that leadership for good, right? And give them resources so that they can find their gifts as I did, find their purpose and really try to instill their value in them. Because a lot of the decisions that our young people are making in the communities like the one I come from, they're not waking up saying, hey, I want to do something bad, right? It's about a lack of value and a lack of hope that I feel like we all play a role in establishing or giving to them, right? These communities that don't have access to certain opportunities where incarceration is so normalized, where the role models, the people, I'll try to be for them what I didn't have. I see my situation in a lot of ways through my parents, my grandmother, even in their situation, and I got lucky. I knew that I was loved. I never was hungry, even though I grew up in a community where other people were, right? That meant something in a very literal way. That can make your decision making, that can make your morality or your moral compass be a bit different than somebody who eats every day, right?
Yeah.
And that's not an excuse. That's not a justification for some of the actions that people do, but it's the truth. Right, it's the real in terms of what informs decisions by young people. We're talking about children, and so for me, I've tried to build a certain level of supports. I've tried to inform policy. I've tried to enlighten folks to say that this conversation around incarceration or its impacts does not stop at inmates. Right? You have to think about who those people belong to or who belong to them, and what are we doing to stand in the gaps when those people are away? What are we doing to create a community that will allow those people who 95% of them will return to us, allow them to do it the right way once they return, and if not for their sake, then for the sake of their children and ours. Because at the end of the day, I have two daughters. They share classroom with children that may have an incarcerated parent. I care about what happens to those children because they share space with my children, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That brings me to a question. I want to turn in a moment to ask to enable a question from the crowd. I have only one rule, which is no manifestos, just ask a question. Yeah. Straightforward, interrogative question. But, I happen to know, Tony, you and I are essentially the same age. There are places still, I believe, in this country where men who look like us in their 20s and 30s, 1 out of every 2 would either have been or still be in the carceral custody of the state. Mm-hmm. And that, in a conversation like this one, that's a pretty stark reality. Yeah. There's a zero-sumness to it. When you, for the point that you just made, that your kids are making a world with the kids of others who are in different circumstances from you, how does that fact inform your work?
Yeah. It really is the driving force in my work, right? In my work in helping men and women when they return from incarceration, which I've been doing the last 19 years. My whole adult life has been working in reentry, to pushing for school systems to identify children with incarcerated parents and provide certain supports for them. Yeah.
And when we were talking outside just now, you told me something about that statistic that was fascinating, about just that.
So, you think about it, you got in America, right? This is the whole universe of children in our country. 1 in 14 children have an incarcerated parent. 1 in 9 black children have an incarcerated parent, right? And so this is walking in our classrooms, and I think sometimes schools are more, I think they're reluctant because they don't want to, in their mind, open up Pandora's box. But I got a news flash. Pandora's box been open. It's open. You just choosing not to look at it. So I've been trying to work here in DC with DCPS. We created a social-emotional services forum where parents could check off a box in terms of identifying traumas that their child might be going through, with the hopes of getting support around that trauma. Having an incarcerated parent is one of them. My thing is to get it on the enrollment form, though, not just here in DC, but across the country, so that we can get in front of that. And in my work with the book and going and doing these author talks in schools across the country, and seeing children be so transparent with me after reading Slug. Like, I'm just like that. I'm going through that right now. And teachers are like, I had no idea. So this is also a support and a help for teachers, particularly teachers that may not necessarily come from a similar situation or similar community. So it's important that we take this seriously, that we know that having an incarcerated parent may be the greatest destabilizer, that it's a cue that there are other additional traumas going on, that children with incarcerated parents are maybe 6 or 7 times more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system at some point. And far-reaching, we have to start thinking about an incarceration where if we grew up in the same community, that one of us will have some involvement in the criminal justice system. What does that mean for those around us? And the women in our community are right behind us. What does that mean for the community as a whole? What does that even mean for our ability to help, right? Everything is marginalized in that way if we're not strategic and intentional. We can't continue to wait. And we can't really piecemeal our interventions or piecemeal how we're going to tackle this American problem, because we have to address it from all ends. People say that they know the problem, but I'm not sure that they do, right? It's deeper than you can't really see this. You can't take sort of this, my man D. Watkins says, he talks about the drone point of view, right? You can't have a voice, like this really has to be informed by people that not only have went through things but are currently going through it, that people that are on the ground. And in a lot of these forums that I have had the opportunity to participate in or be in the audience, many times I feel like we talk about people that work on the ground, and then we talk about the policymakers as if one trumps the other. The people that just work on the ground seem to be not necessarily their vantage point is like something we all get. But the policymakers are kind of the high end, right? Which I don't dispute that. But the people on the ground have, in my opinion, the best point of view, the point of view that we all have to go to them and get informed by them to really cultivate policy that's going to in turn really help the people that are going through these issues.
Yeah. Let us turn to a question over here from our very astute audience.
Hi, my name is Natasha Baker. I work for Open City Advocates. We're a nonprofit legal firm here in DC representing juveniles in the DC juvenile justice system. And I had a question about your work in schools and bringing in trauma-informed practices. What has been your experience working with the presence of police in schools? Because in our experience, and the research shows that this is another iteration of mass incarceration driving more kids into the system. And so while you're pushing for trauma-informed practices, every school in DCPS has police in the schools too. So could you please speak to that aspect of your work?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm not comfortable with sort of the police being in schools. At the same time, we have to start the insecurity in general, right? We have to start to think about. I've also pushed to sort of get formerly incarcerated folks or people, community-based folks, more intertwined into our school systems. I feel like that you have organizations here that had like Cure the Streets and things of that nature, individuals that if they could be in the schools, it'd be less likely the need for, security or law enforcement, people that can connect with these young people and inspire them and hold them accountable. I think because, and this is the other part, what happens is that children get desensitized to police and their presence when they're everywhere they are. And we have to think about that. Like I went to Gonzaga College High School. We had like 2 security guards that they secured the premises. They didn't secure us though. They didn't, we have to go through metal detectors and these type of things. So young people get desensitized to police officers. Police in my community were a constant presence. They were part of my everyday life, interaction with police officers, being searched by police officers. I'm talking as early as the age of 10 and 11 throughout my life. This stuff, so again, these are the other parts of this that we don't talk about enough. What does that do to a young person growing up, right? In terms of their value, how they feel about themselves, how they see themselves, and even what they can see themselves to be. And we have to do a better job of connecting the dots and seeing individuals that have been incarcerated or has been justice involved on any level, that they hold the key sometimes. They hold the answers to some of these problems.
That's a powerful question you just left us with. And fortunately, you've written a whole book that these folks can explore that question with further. Tony Lewis Jr., thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
And now, a conversation on the next steps for criminal justice. Please welcome Matthew Charles, a Justice Reform Fellow at Families Against Mandatory Minimums and the first person to be released from prison under the First Step Act. Deanna Hoskins, President and CEO of Just Leadership USA, and Pat Nolan, Director of the American Conservative Union's Center for Criminal Justice Reform. They're joined by Kathleen Koch, author and journalist.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Now, you know we're here to discuss the First Step Act, which is a bipartisan criminal justice reform bill that the president signed in December, and that most people agree really represents the most sweeping change in a generation to our nation's federal prison and sentencing laws. Matthew, I'd like to start with you because you're the first person released under the First Step Act. Could you explain to us what aspect of the law applied to your case and how it's impacted you personally in your community?
The aspect of the First Step Act that applied to me was the fact that it made retroactive the changes that were made to the 2010 sentencing guidelines by the Obama administration. They were not made retroactive at the time, so you had two classifications of inmates, those sentenced pre-2010 and those sentenced post. So therefore, I was caught up in the pre-situation, and because it wasn't made retroactive, I still had to have the sentence that was based on the racial disparity that caused them to actually change it post-2010.
So how has it impacted your life? I mean, you're free.
What has impacted me?
Doesn't get better than that, right?
Exactly. The main way it impacted me was the fact that I'm free, and that over 3,000 other inmates have the opportunity to be set free as well. That is clearly, everybody has stated that it was based on racial disparity, so now they get a chance to have their sentences reviewed and released.
Deanna, your organization did not support the First Step Act. Could you talk to us about your reservations? And then, now that it has become law, what do you hope it will achieve?
So I want to start by, whenever there's a bill, there's certain aspects to a bill. So definitely the fair sentencing retroactive was a part that we did support. What we could not support, being an organization that's focused on half by 2030, decarcerating the U.S. correctional population, was portions of it around the earned credit. So one thing, First Step Act went totally against best practices. It actually evidence did not drive the policy.
How so?
So in the Earned Act, it specifically says that access is allowed to low-risk individuals.
Nonviolent offenders.
Not nonviolent, low risk. And that was a misconception because people tendency to think risk and crime go together, and they don't. I can be an individual who has committed a crime, never been incarcerated, commit murder, and actually score low risk on a risk assessment tool. So let's talk about the low risk, the evidence-based practice of it. Research shows, and being a person who managed the Second Chance portfolio, research shows that any recidivism reduction program should go to those most at risk of recidivating. It actually says when you give individuals who are low risk programming, you actually have a propensity to increase their recidivism rate. So that was the first part. Individuals, when you said low risk individuals qualify for this earned time credit to be able to get out on e-incarceration, historically, African Americans, based on how our communities are policed, based on how our schools have more school resource officers than guidance counselor, the static portions of a risk assessment ask questions I'll never be able to change in my life. So I can never change the fact that I have a PhD today, but I didn't graduate high school. I'll never be able to change the fact of my first interaction with law enforcement and how old I was. I'll never be able to change the fact of how many probation violations I have. Those are the static dynamics of a risk assessment before you get to the institutional behavior to see where a person is. So historically, based on historical stop and frisk, racial profiling, African Americans and Latinos actually have a higher risk of their interaction with law enforcement. So based on that portion, we were already screened out. Not only were we screened out, you started carving out the crimes. And I think the most part that I got totally upset was the retroactive of the crack to cocaine disparity was one. But the actual casualties of the war on drugs, let's be honest, the 1994 crime bill was a bipartisan criminal justice bill at that time that had unintended consequences that resulted in mass incarceration. So this wasn't nothing new, but it was being perpetrated as it was. So when we really look at, we weren't decarcerating. To put people on incarceration means we are actually expanding the carceral state into our communities. So an affluent community may not be over-policed because you may have one person in your community. We can end up with 15 people in a marginalized, disadvantaged community on incarceration. And let's be honest, when you're on incarceration, you're still under the custody of the correctional system.
Let's bring Pat in here.
Yeah.
Pat, do you share any of these concerns? It's interesting, though, your organization, which is conservative, it might surprise some people to hear that you supported the Next Step Act. So where do you think it's going to make a difference first? And did you share some of these same concerns that Deanna's organization did?
Well, I don't compromise on principle. I do on strategy. And the fact of the matter is, the perfect is the enemy of the good. If we'd waited for a perfect bill, Matthew would still be incarcerated, and he'd be incarcerated for 11 more years. So I don't know how it's in the interest of communities to continue to incarcerate a man like Matthew. And there's an old saying, half a loaf is better than none. And just from the very name of the legislation, the First Step Act, it shows it's our intent to continue. But you've got to start somewhere, and this was a major step forward in changing the view of offenders from a burden on society to potentially contributors to society. And this is intended to stop the warehousing of individuals and instead prepare them so they can be good parents, good neighbors, good tax-paying citizens. Somebody that's unemployed because of their offense doesn't have much chance of making it. And this is intended to help them make it. You say it's unusual for conservatives. I would strongly disagree. I've been working for these reforms for over 20 years, 22 years to be exact. And when I came out of prison, I'd been very active politically. Among my peers, they were as upset about the overuse of incarceration as my liberal friends, but they brought a lot more to the table. They brought credibility so that people like Newt Gingrich, Grover Norquist, Ken Cuccinelli, former AG of Virginia, Hal Stratton, the former AG of New Mexico, said this is wrong. Government, through the incarceration system, is able to deny people total control of their lives because some obscure law says that they're evil, not because the act is inherently evil, but because they've broken the law. Not necessarily harmed anybody, but they've broken the law. We take them from their home, from their communities, from their church, from their work, and we lock them up with no control over their life. They can't choose when to get up, what to do with their time all day, when to eat, what to eat. They're restricting their ability to worship God. All those things the government has the authority to do, but it should be used rarely. Instead, we overuse it.
There were conservative senators, though, who tried to block this and who did think it would decrease safety in the United States.
They were definitely the aberrants, okay? Tom Cotton and John Kennedy. But on the other hand, you had Mike Lee, Rand Paul, Lindsey Graham, all pushing hard for this. Again, I mentioned I've been at this 22 years. The first issue I was involved in was the right of people to practice their faith in prison. Harry Reid was trying to strip prisoners of the protection of the First Amendment. And, we recruited Ted Kennedy and John Ashcroft to join together to fight
An
this.
unlikely pairing.
Yes, but it won. And just like on this, we had Dick Durbin and Chuck Grassley. This issue unites people.
Let's go to Matthew. Matthew, again, you obviously benefited immensely from this law, but you also submitted an op-ed to the Washington Post over the last month saying you'd like to see more changes. So what do you think was not included that should have been?
The fact that there are still a lot of people that's over sentenced that the First Step Act will not reach.
What do you mean over sentenced?
In other words, because as she was just stating, back in when the Criminal Justice Act came out, it over-sentenced people because it overreacted. And now those changes are being made to correct those things that were done at that time. So there's still a lot of people in there, or when I say in there, are in prison that have sentences that exceed what is probably based on the crime that they actually committed. So therefore, for those people to have their sentence reviewed, and for those that have been incarcerated for a particular period of time that exceed 15 years, to be able to have a way to have their sentences reviewed, because as Mr. Nolan has stated, people change. People are going to be released back into society. And the disagreement, I really don't want to call it a disagreement, that I have with what was said a little bit earlier as far as the First Step Back is like, didn't do enough. We know that it didn't do enough. We know that there's more that's going to need to be done. But no action instead of some action and then fighting for more action just doesn't make logical sense to me.
And
Deanna, okay, go ahead.
And I totally want to follow up on that, because we weren't saying throw the whole bathtub out. We were saying any portions that continue to entrench the structural racism that the system was built on, we don't want to entrench any more harm. We want to keep moving indefinitely the portions. Someone asked me if there were certain things in this bill that you would have to say, okay, I have to support it. I have to be with Matthew. The Fair Sentencing Act was retro in this bill, but when life was changed to 25 years, and in most states it's 20, it wasn't retroactive. The stacking provisions moving forward, had those been retroactive, I would have had to say, you know what? There are so many individuals who were impacted by the war on drugs that are going to be released now, who have 50-year sentences. But those individuals, like Matthew said, aren't being impacted at all. To me, it didn't rectify any of the harms that had been previously done on that portion. But definitely never throw out the whole bathtub, but just make sure whatever bill we're pushing is not entrenching any more harms to a certain population.
Yeah, Deanna, I was wondering, do you and Pat, both of you do work at the local levels and state level a good bit. Do you think that's where some of the future solutions are going to be evolving? I mean, that clearly is where the majority of our incarcerated inmates are, some 91%.
It actually has to be where it happens. What we want to make sure of is that whatever we saw within the First Step Act that has the potential to entrench harms or didn't have a far enough reach, that as we move into the states, we make sure those things are course corrected.
Anything you see in particular that you like that should be in a Second Step Act?
Not yet.
No, yeah? Okay, Pat.
No, I know Florida's starting to, I haven't seen their bill and their proposal at this time.
Well, actually, this started in the states. We've been active in the states for years. Tough on Crime, Texas, changed their laws. They've been able to, they basically reserve prison space for people that are a danger to society, and they correct the actions of others through community placement so they can stay with their families. That freed up money that could increase mental health services, increase drug treatment, and job placement. They've been able to close 8 prisons. And the most important things to conservatives is we've been able to do that while reducing crime to the lowest point since 1967. That doesn't happen by accident. It makes but intelligent choices, not over-incarcerating, but choosing incarceration for those that pose an actual threat while instead dealing with people that we're just angry with in the community. And that has been the formula in South Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Utah, Alaska, North Dakota. So it's already happening at the state level. Now, the passage of the First Step Act has shown that left and right can work together.
Right, so it can motivate change where it hasn't
it's
happened
already,
yet on the local
right,
level.
as you said, 90% are in state prisons. That's where we're really going to change the overuse of incarceration.
Matthew.
I just wanted to add the fact that the First Step Act also made it able for judges to utilize discretion in their own courtrooms. When I was incarcerated for those 22 years, 21 and a half before I was released, then went back for 7 months, the fact that the sentences were mandatory when I came in because the United States guidelines were mandatory. They were changed to advisory, but again, it wasn't made retroactive, so it didn't affect me.
There was no judicial discretion.
That's correct. So in 1998, in 2000, and 2010, the laws were changed that indirectly affected me, but didn't directly affect me because they had no benefit of releasing me. However, those laws were changed. And because they were changed, people were saying, okay, this is wrong, we need to fix it. Now, us that were incarcerated, and I can speak because I've done 22 years, us who are incarcerated didn't say, well, you're fixing it for them, but what about us? No, we're happy that you're getting it right. To me, the First Step Act gets it right in the sense that it is doing something to help those that are now coming in. And the fact that the judge now has the discretion to give somebody alternative sentencing, whether they need treatment, mental illness help, instead of incarceration, as opposed to saying, I have to sentence you to just based on the sentencing guidelines. To me, that was a win in all directions as well.
Before we go to audience for questions, Deanna and Pat, I wanted to ask you, because I know this is really personal for everyone here. You've all done some time. Are you optimistic as we look down the road that more reforms will come? And what most worries you in the way of roadblocks? I know some are concerned about our current Attorney General, who, when he was in the same role in the 90s, was really the architect of the get tough on crime philosophy that led to mass incarceration in the United States.
I think I'm definitely optimistic. I think one of the things that we have to address that we continue to sweep under the rug is this nonviolent versus violent scenario and what actually equals violence, especially when we know most perpetrators of violence at one time were a victim, a witness, and then a perpetrator. And when people actually identify where violence took place, it normally starts in their home, their neighborhood, their school, then prison. And traditionally, when we look at how people are charged, again, and I'm going to keep sticking with this structural racism part of it, because in certain communities, charges are stacked and done in a different way that equals a violent tendency that truly may not have been an act of violence at all. And in America, we convict based on a charge, and we don't take a lot of the individual trauma and things that have taken place. I think Tony talked about that being here. So for me, I'm definitely optimistic, but we as a society maybe have to stop talking about criminal justice and talk about social justice and restoring human dignity inside individuals so we can get rid of this narrative of who's deserving and who's not.
Pat.
Yeah. Well, we believe that people do bad things and need to be held accountable. There are some people that pose a great danger. I agree, we've over-defined violence to where a lot of things none of us would consider violent are classified as that. But there are people that we're legitimately afraid of. I grew up, one of my dance partners as a kid was Squeaky Fromme, one of Charles Manson's folks. Okay, that's truly frightening. She was a danger to society, all right? So we think we need prisons, we just way overuse it. And we think the sentence for a crime should never do more harm than the underlying act. And so many of our sentences do more harm than whatever was done that was wrong. So we are optimistic. I think our biggest danger with the First Step Act is the bureaucracy just refuses to let go of folks.
Talking Federal Bureau of Prisons?
Right, the Federal Bureau of Prisons. We had a provision in there that defined what Congress had always said, that good time credit was 57 days a year. 54, sorry. The BOP arbitrarily said it's 47. So Congress said, hey, you're cheating these folks out of 7 days per year. If you've done a 10-year stretch, that's 70 days. That's real time. And the BOP has said, well, yes, it changed the law, but we have 120 days in which to implement it. Well, hell, that should have, everybody under that provision was cheated out of that time. Why weren't they immediately released? What's the interest of the BOP in holding people longer than Congress said they should be held? So one thing to understand, I'm a conservative. I've fought against mindless bureaucracies my whole life. And to understand prisons, take a DMV office, string barbed wire around it, and give the clerks guns.
Ooh.
Yep.
Well, on that note, let's go to questions. All right, we got one back here.
Hi, my name is Nancy Trevino. I'm with the Community Change and the Fair Immigration Reform Movement. And I'm wondering, with your perspective, organizations, has the conversation of restorative practice come up and how that's functioning within the prison system? And is there any kind of advocacy or policy you're pushing in regards to that?
So for Just Leadership, we're definitely leading with our mission around restorative justice and working with an organization called Common Justice in New York, because there is a restorative process of this. When we talk about restorative justice, there are 3 aspects. There's the encounter, the amend, and the restoration. And it not only restores both parties, but it allows the individuals to be restored within themselves. And we have to start bringing it to the table, because most victims don't want to continue to see the perpetrator in prison and be caused more harm. They actually want to know why did this person do this, and how they can forgive and heal and move on. And so we have to continue to create these circles and this safe space to do that. And, you know, for 3 individuals who have been incarcerated sitting on this stage, part of the process is society has forgiven us and restored us, and we have been able to be successful in our career, but it's thousands of Matthews, Pat, and Deannas out there that don't have these type of opportunities, and we have to be fair and just in everything we do and restore a person. When you're sentenced, there's a ceremony. The judge hits the gavel, you're carted off. When you're released, there's no ceremony.
Right.
We just release you back and say, go be successful, but all of this trauma, no one has helped restore me. So definitely restorative justice has to be key and a mission of all organizations.
I was blessed to come out of prison, hired by Chuck Colson to work at Prison Fellowship. Restorative justice is absolutely part of the fabric of Prison Fellowship. And I'd been very active in the victims' rights movement in California. I received the Victims Advocate Award from Parents of Murdered Children. It's in the interest of prosecutors to keep victims angry, but it's not in the victim's interest. And what I find is victims want all the lies and BS to stop. Say you did it, say you're sorry. And from that point on, the victims are very forward-looking. They don't want to destroy the person's life. Instead, more often, by far overwhelmingly, they'll say, how can we make sure you don't harm anybody else again? And that's very positive. You say that healing is important for both of them, but also for the community.
Wow. All right, next question. Okay, back here.
Hi, I'm Tammy Seltzer. We work with individuals, DC residents who have serious mental illness who are returning to the community. And as you know, DC residents, we don't have a prison system, so they end up in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I was happy to hear the passion about the Federal Bureau of Prisons. We've seen Inspector General reports from the Department of Justice. We've seen the Marshall Project research show that people with mental illness within the Federal Bureau of Prisons are having their diagnoses changed. They're being put in solitary when they're not supposed to. Who is going to hold the Bureau of Prisons accountable when they're under the Department of Justice, which both oversees them and runs these prisons? Is there anything happening on the national level to address those issues?
Doug Collins, the Republican sponsor of the First Step Act, his next step is mental health reform. This is something I've been active on. As a freshman legislator in the minority party with opposite party governor, I got $1 million for LA County to set up a forensic mental health facility to treat those with mental illness. They had nothing. But they shouldn't be incarcerated. They're sick. They're not bad. Now, of course, there are people that are dangerous, but most of them aren't. But by default, they've ended up in jails and prisons. This has been a passion. I'm meeting with the DA of LA, who's very good on this, Jackie Lacey. This is the next step, de-incarcerating the mentally ill, getting them treatment in the community that's frankly far cheaper, it's more humane, and it takes the burden off our jails and prisons, and they can concentrate on the traditional imprisonment rather than trying to deal with the people society's dumped on them.
We are out of time, and I wish we could go on. This has been such a great conversation. Please thank my wonderful panel, Matthew, Deanna, and Pat. Thank you.
And now for a session produced by our underwriter. Please welcome Carlton Miller, Senior Associate at Forward.us, and Zoe Towns, Criminal Justice Director for Forward.us.
Good morning. I'm Zoe Towns, and it's a delight to be here. It has been a real honor to help support this event with the Atlantic. Any morning that begins with Desmond Meade and Deanna Hoskins and Pat Nolan is a morning that brings us a little closer to where we need to be on this issue, I think. So we're grateful for that. So quickly, Forward.us is a political advocacy organization that works to advance immigration and criminal justice reforms. We believe these are two man-made systems, and these systems interrupt opportunity for hundreds of millions of Americans and separate far too many families. So we all know, and we've heard today, that a big part of driving change is in correctly and better defining the problem. And we hear a lot about, and we kind of came up in this field hearing a lot about the over 2 million people who are currently behind bars in jails or prisons in America. And we know that this is a massive undercounting of the actual impact of incarceration on this country. As whether we're taxpayers, whether we are thinking about ourselves as participants in a democracy whose promise and whose legitimacy is daily undermined by a lack of justice and a lack of freedom and a lack of fairness. These are all ways in which these systems are interrupting the promise of who we can be. So with that in mind, we embarked on a project about a year ago with Cornell University to try to count for the first time how many people have a family member, a direct family member who has spent time behind bars, and trying to capture what that experience looks like for those many Americans. And Carlton will talk a little bit more about that, but I was moved today to hear Mr. Lewis say that we need to think about who these people belong to and who belong to them. And that's what we've been thinking a lot about at Forward, about family and how to use family as a frame to understand the ways in which these systems are undermining us, and also the ways in which we can hopefully change and empower ourselves to be better. So Carlton Miller is a colleague and a friend at Forward.us. Before coming to Forward, Carlton worked in the governor's office in Louisiana, where he ushered in and oversaw a really tremendous sentencing reform bill that moved Louisiana from the top incarcerating state to the second top incarcerating state, but we're going to keep moving. Yeah. And it was a really fantastic sentencing reform bill that brought home thousands of Louisianans to their families. So Carlton, tell us more about family.
All right, thanks, Zoe. So hi everybody, good morning. I am Carlton Miller, Senior Associate at Forward.us. I'm here to have a quick conversation about families and the impact that families are facing as a result of incarceration. But before I do, I kind of just want to get to know the audience a little bit. So by showing of hands, no pressure at all, how many of you are happy to be here today? All right, great. That's everybody. That's an easy question. How many of you all were happy to hear from Tony Lewis and Dina Hoskins and Matthew Charles and Pat Nolan this morning? All right, great. So here's a serious question to ponder. How many of you know someone or have a family member that has spent time behind bars? Wow. That's astounding. You're not alone. Our report, titled Every Second, finds that nearly half of all the adults in the United States have had an immediate family member that has spent time behind bars. Everyone that rose your hand today, you're one of the 113 million that has been impacted by incarceration. Over the past few years, we have, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get the slide to work. All right. Over the past few years, Forward US has been working to reform our incarceration system. And we saw that this was no small matter. Having a loved one incarcerated leaves you with a high financial, high health toll. We saw that over the past 4 decades that there was a massive rise in our jail and prison population. So what does this mean? This means that the impacts of incarceration has gone beyond the prison walls and has touched every single one of the persons that has raised their hand today. We saw that in our report that incarceration impacts all communities. For instance, communities that are Republican and Democrats face impact just the same. But we know by fact that all communities don't bear this burden the same. We just heard from several panelists, they talked about the interactions with law enforcement in certain communities. And research backs up that communities where African Americans are present and Latinos, that they're more likely to be stopped, arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated for longer periods of time. Therefore, it's not surprising that blacks are 50% more likely to have an immediate family member that's incarcerated. But I'm not here today to throw a bunch of statistics at you. I can talk about data all day. I'm here to give you all a greater appreciation for our report every second. I'm here to tell you a story about a young man who watched his family suffer as a result of his eldest brother's incarceration. I'm here to show you that these individuals use these experiences to fuel their fire and to make change in their communities. Today, I'm here to leave you with my story. It is my hope that it informs you, but it also inspires you about the urgency of now. So, with that being said, I'll leave you all with my story. Thank you. The day I got home and my mom told me that my brother was going back to prison. It was a day I will never forget. Those 2 years when he was out were the happiest of my life. I remember him coming home and just jumping into his arms. I was about 6 years old at the time. He would always make sure that I had school supplies, I had the proper clothing for school. For 2 years, I was used to my eldest brother, being there. Just remembering my mom telling me that my brother, may not be coming back home. It was surreal to see my brother later that evening on TV, seeing my mom crying. That was a huge change for all of us. My mom was a single parent. She worked multiple jobs, including night shifts. She went through financial troubles trying to pay for an attorney and also take care of our family. She took strength from her faith and instilled that in all of us. But it's hard. Just the other week, for the first time, my mom told me, she's getting tired. She's turning 70 this upcoming year, and having to drive those lonely roads by herself, really takes a toll on her.
And you go down about 20 some miles and you run into the prison. It has its own zip code. That's a lonely ride. But when I would get to see him, I would put a smile on my face. I wouldn't let him see this pain, the stress. I had to be strong for my son.
Giving life updates to my brother, whether it was football games, the moment I met my now wife, and the dates that we went on, the wedding planning that I went through, the honeymoon that we went on. It's hard on a family living from phone call to phone call, visit to visit, paycheck to paycheck, year after year. I've grown up, worked hard. My brother's situation inspired me to study law. His sentence would likely be shorter if he were convicted of the same crime in a different state than Louisiana. It's been a long, hard road to get where I am today, but I've embraced that difficulty. The way I see it, the highs and lows in a person's life make up the shape of a key that you can use to unlock the door to opportunity, to liberty, and I call that key hope. I've gone from being a lawyer in Louisiana to working in state government to fighting for policy reform on a federal level in Washington, D.C. And I might not have my brother physically here with me now. My mother might not have her son, but these experiences provide us with an opportunity to continue to share this story and give folks an understanding of how our criminal justice system has truly impacted our citizens. So let's stop arguing and start fixing. I'm Carlton, and I'm one in two Americans that have been impacted by the incarceration crisis.
For a conversation on one example of successful reform at the state level, please welcome Desmond Meade, the leader of the campaign to restore voting rights to the formerly incarcerated in Florida. Back with the Atlantic's Matt Thompson.
So Desmond, as that welcome attests, you are coming off quite a year. I grew up in Central Florida, but I had never had the distinction of being a finalist for Central Floridian of the Year as you are this year. My biggest accolade was third place in the Seminole County Spelling Bee. So congratulations.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm just like real humbled by a lot of this, because I remember in August of 2005 when I was standing in front of railroad tracks, waiting on a train to come so I can jump in front of it. I was homeless, I was addicted to drugs, recently released from prison, and I knew that my parents didn't raise me to be in that position, but there I was. And so to go from a space where I felt that I was a disappointment to my family, particularly to my mother, and to be in the space like I am now is amazing, but it's humbling. And as I was driving here, I was thinking I wish my mom could still be alive to actually just see this, be with me. She would have been sitting right here.
Yeah. Now, having grown up in Central Florida, I was raised Catholic, but spent a lot of my time with the Southern Baptist Convention. And I've got to tell you, when I heard about the beginning of the campaign for Amendment 4, I didn't think it would work. Having been in the community that I was in Central Florida, I said, there's no way Florida is going to do this, much less 64% on a bipartisan vote. Why? How did that?
It wasn't supposed to work, Matt. To be honest with you, especially when you think about it, that you talk about an issue like felon disenfranchisement that has a history and racial animus. When you talk about voting, and when you talk about the state of Florida, those are like three toxic subjects. And then to think about the political climate that we're in, where there's so much hate and there's so much fear and division, that we were never supposed to be on the ballot. We were never supposed to be successful. But you started out talking about the Baptist Convention and being a Catholic. One of the things that I am not ashamed of saying, it is, especially with due respect to folks who may not have a religious preference or may be atheist or whatever. I'm not, right? And I consider myself a Christian, and I tell folks that this campaign was ordained by God. It was a vision that God gave me years ago. And from day one, I had some seasoned prayer warriors that every morning at 5 and 7 would get on a prayer line to lift up this campaign in prayer. And this campaign, from start to finish, it really defied conventional thinking. And we were able to do some amazing things, and we were able to get unlikely allies.
I want to stick with the allies for a moment. As a Catholic, one of our big messages to the world is forgiveness. Were we? How was the church as a partner in your work?
I'm glad you're a Catholic that's asking that question, right? So I could say, to be honest with you, that was a personal disappointment for me, because I would expect, that the church to be the first one on board, particularly the Catholic Church. Because I remember going around, and even when I talked to anyone that was a person of faith, because you remember Florida had this clemency policy that made a person wait 5 or 7 years before they're allowed to even apply to have their rights restored. And then after they apply, they have to wait sometimes as long as 15 years just to get a no. And I always go back to, when I talk to a person of faith, I always go back to the story of when Jesus was on the cross, and there was a criminal that asked him to be saved. And I always say, Jesus didn't tell him he had to wait 5 or 7 years. What he said was this day. And that interchange between Jesus and the felon, right, what it spoke to, it spoke to the heart of all faith. Whether it was Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, it spoke to this concept of forgiveness, redemption, and restoration. And so I knew that this issue was a natural fit for people of faith. And at the end, I think we ran the largest faith-based engagement campaign, where we had over 827 institutions of faith that participated in a Let My People Vote campaign, right, for Amendment 4. And we had Jewish synagogues, we had Islamic mosques, we had conservative Christians, we had Latino evangelicals, we had the traditional African American churches.
Did you have Catholics?
There may have been some there, but their endorsement came rather disappointingly late. But on board, the first denomination on board was the AME Church, that was actually led by Bishop Richardson in the 11th Episcopal District, and then you had other smatterings of churches, and then like the Latino evangelicals, NALEC, they got on board once there was approached. And so I was very just moved by the amount of congregations that were engaging. And then we had, I cannot think of the name, but the RAC, right? Reform, come on, somebody help me out there. It's a Jewish federation, a national Jewish federation.
We'll encourage folks to look it up. Now, our session this morning is called The Power of Experience. And so I want to turn to your experience for a moment. Before I do, I want to show a brief video just about a little bit about Amendment 4 in the campaign.
Here tonight in Florida that is important. Amendment 4, that passed. So whatever happens tonight, that amendment is going to be hugely important for voting rights in Florida.
This country was able to see that love won the day in Florida. We were able to transcend partisan politics and racial anxieties and organize people along the lines of humanity. We were able to bring together people from all backgrounds, from all walks of life, from all political persuasions, under a common cause that once a debt is paid, is paid. There's still more work to be done, and we're looking forward to walking along with our partners and allies as we continue to expand democracy, not only in the state of Florida,
see in that last frame in that video tears of, I assume, joy on your face. And but this journey, or this phase of your journey, this stage of your journey, began in a very different place. Take us for a moment, if you would, to August, the fall of 2005, summer of 2005.
Yeah, so that day was a hot, humid day, but I was actually able to block out that heat and humidity because the only thing that was going through my mind was how much pain I was going to feel. That train hit me, and
you were standing on.
I was standing right there waiting
for a train.
Even the thought about the pain that I would have to go through was not enough to make me move, and I still stood there, and I waited and I waited and I waited. But God had other plans, and I ended up crossing those tracks, and I walked a couple blocks further, and there was a central intake facility that allowed me to get into a drug program. And after completing that, I moved into a homeless shelter. And while there, my goal was just to not use drugs again, and I wanted to do something. And so I enrolled in college, Miami-Dade College, and I did extremely well. And eventually, I got accepted into law school. And
what was the role of that experience in making all of this possible? How did that experience play into the work?
Well, one of the first things that it taught me that just going through that experience, and I realized, and I look back now at the things that I've gone through, and the things that used to cause me shame, right? It kind of now, I throw my shoulders back a little bit because I realized that God had chosen me to take me through some things in order to be of greater service to Him. Right, because sometimes if you haven't gone through some things, it's hard for you to, number one, give a testimony, right? And then the second thing, it's hard for you to really connect. And so to be able to be at that rock bottom place allowed me to understand something that we've known for quite some time, but we really don't act on it like we should. And that is, we've always heard that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And that same concept applies to our community, to our country. That, if we really want to be, aspire to be this great country, that we have to empower those that is weakest among us. And part of that group are people who have been vilified and have been the scourge of the earth, people with felony convictions, and so, or the people that were homeless, the people that were hooked on drugs or our foster care system, and so I knew that there had to be special attention on what can we do to uplift people in those categories. What can we uplift? What can we do to uplift people that's traditionally been looked at as the weakest in our society? Knowing that if we invest in them, we invest in ourselves, right? And so I think I was able to really parlay that message in multiple ways, right? And one of them being like Amendment 4, understanding that Amendment 4 wasn't just about the person with the felony conviction that wanted to vote. Amendment 4 was about our society. Amendment 4 was about each and every individual that paid less to educate their child than to incarcerate the individual. Amendment 4 was about what we wanted our community to be.
Yeah. Now, one of the many partners that you had in this work was a man that some would describe as an unlikely partner, white, politically Republican guy, Neil Volz, who had a different entryway into this conversation. Neil had the experience of having been convicted of a felony, which awakened him to the reality of life after that conviction, and inflamed him also with a passion for the work that you did together. Some might hear that story and say, but you know what? He was convicted of a white-collar crime. one of the parts of the education that several journalists, certainly in DC, have had over the past couple of years has been about the spread of white-collar crime. Jesse Eisinger's book about how under-prosecuted white-collar crime is. And some might say that crime should be more prosecuted, so more people would have that experience with the criminal justice system. Would that be an argument that you would share?
No, it wouldn't be. And the reason why it wouldn't be because when even just hearing this question now, that's not what's going through my head. What's going through my head is, and I think that, and I don't want it to come off as a critique of the work that we're doing, but I think more of an adjustment, all right, or suggestion, I should say, is that sometimes we do separate these things. So when I looked at Neil, I didn't see someone who was convicted of a white-collar crime who may not have, I didn't even know that he didn't do any jail time until we were on Samantha Bee together. And folks who've seen my reaction, it was just a natural reaction where I just rolled my eyes. I was like, wow, But I didn't see that. What I seen was another human being who was convicted of a felony offense that suffered some collateral consequences, right? And so part of this process is showing me that, for instance, in Florida, less than 25% of people who are convicted of a felony offense are sentenced to prison, all right? And so my thing was, do I focus on the less than 25% and build a narrative around them? Or do I include everyone? Because guess what? Even though you've never been to prison, if you're convicted of a felony offense, you face basically the same collateral consequences. The only thing that you probably haven't experienced is the trauma of being incarcerated. But when you're through with your sentence, you still can't vote, still can't get a job, you still face housing discrimination, and you're still wearing that red letter, scarlet letter of shame of being a felon. And so, when we, especially particularly around Amendment 4, understanding that I cannot, devalue anyone's personal experience with the criminal justice system, right? Because then you'll have people say, well, man, you only did 4 years. I did 40. Then you'll have, well, I did 45. So, I'm more deserving than you or whatever. I think, no, what it is that holistically, when we look at things, we're able to understand that there is something inherently wrong with the system, and particularly when it related to Amendment 4, the phrase, one of the things that we used was, listen, when the debt is paid, whether a person was in prison, whether a person was not. And as it turns out, the majority of the people were not sentenced to prison, and that drastically shifted the focus on who Amendment 4 was benefiting, which I think was very critical in helping us to pass Amendment 4.
I'm going to turn to our audience in a moment with a question, but before I do, the same eve, that same election that brought Amendment 4 into power was one that happened in a context in which Amendment 4 being the biggest expansion of voting rights since the Voting Rights Act, I believe, it was one in which the Voting Rights Act was also under some of its greatest challenges since it was first enacted nationwide. Voting rights across the country saw a pretty different picture, even in that election, in the run-up to it and in the aftermath of it. What do you take away from both of these things happening at once? Amendment 4 passing in Florida, and at the same time, voter rights under duress across the country.
That's a great question, right? I think that, and I've been telling folks, I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned in Amendment 4 victory, some of which I haven't learned yet, so I'm still evaluating what happened. But there were some top-line things that happened there. We knew that we had over 5.1 million votes, which was 1 million more votes than any candidate on the ballot that received. Right, that's number one. And then number two was that we know we're guessing that at least 1 million of the people who voted for Amendment 4 also voted for our current governor, Ron DeSantis, right? which shows a shift because typically, especially in progressive spaces, there have been this a dilemma about trying to figure out how to get people to stop voting against their self-interest, right? And Amendment 4 showed that we were able to actually crack that nut, and where people were voting for what was right above their political preferences, above whatever racial anxieties they may have, they voted for their self-interest. And then the other thing was that when we looked at those 5.1 million votes, particularly in this era, in this environment, that none of those votes was based on hate, none was based on fear, but they were rather 5.1 million votes that were based on love and forgiveness. And I am so adamant about really highlighting the fact that on November 6th, that this country got to actually see love winning the day. And I think that that is extremely important. I think it speaks to how we can, there is an avenue to take issues, because I think one of our biggest faults is sometimes we politicize things that are just about humanity, right? And any time that there's political bickering, the people always suffer, right? And so how do we take some basic values, human values, and organize around those values in a way that would transcend partisan divide or bickering and racial anxieties? How do we get to that space? Like, you know, it's a space that we see in the aftermath of natural disasters. Like when the hurricane hit Texas, one of the most riveting scenes that I witnessed was when you had an African-American man that was rescuing a white man in Texas, right? And stopped to let him get his Confederate flag, right? But for understanding what that Confederate flag meant, but for that moment, this man was able to overlook that because before he's seen the Confederate flag, he's seen another human being in need. You know, when we see an accident on the road and we see somebody laying down and we stop and we run out, our first question is not, did you vote for Donald Trump? Our first question is, are you okay? How can I help? You know, and it's in those moments where we are connecting along the lines of humanity that we are powerful, that we are great, you know, that humanity is beautiful. And so that's what I personally want to focus on. How do we get there? You know, how do we get there and move major political controversial issues like felon voting, right? How do we do that with other things? Whether it's immigration, whether it's, you know, other issues that are important to folks. How do we bring people together from all walks of life along those lines and leave all of the partisan bickering to politicians? You know, we take matters in our own hands and we just go ahead and we come to the aid of our fellow human being, whether they're white, black, young, old, rich, poor, Democrat or Republican. We fought just as hard for the person that wished he could have voted for Donald Trump as we did for the person that wanted to vote for Barack Obama.
When you make that movie, it's going to win Best Picture.
Oh, sorry. Good morning. My name is Tiffany Dina Lofton. I'm the National Director for the Youth and College Division at the NAACP. It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you for accepting the invitation to attend this event. You're a revolutionary pioneer, and in the work that folks have been trying to do for a very long time, particularly in the South, you have set a trend, not a bar, not a floor, not a roof. And I'm sure that moving forward, we're going to hear a lot more from you about the lessons that you learned in the organizing and the strategy that you put together to help make this successful. I have two quick questions. One, can you say who were your biggest opponents? Not the biggest haters, but the biggest opponents who were actively organizing against you in Amendment 4. I was in Tallahassee on the night of the victory, and I was at FAMU's campus, and we had the speech from Andrew Gillum after we had heard about Amendment 4, and the binary of how we felt was just overwhelming. I'll talk to you about it later. Yeah. So that's question A, who are your biggest opponents? And question number 2 was, now the implementation process is important, right? Leading up into gubernatorial races that are happening in Louisiana, Kentucky, and Mississippi, and folks who want to continue to try to do the same movement that you did in spaces where we know that gerrymandering is taking place and redistricting is taking place. What help do you need in the implementation process that folks can take note of now to help you prepare for that work, and that other states can lead by example?
So let's do biggest opponent first.
You would want to get to that.
Of course.
So, ironically, we did not have any opposition, believe that? Any opposition that was actively campaigning against us. All right, but I can say that the biggest hurdles or the biggest obstacles that we've had to overcome came from internal, came from allies and friends, to be totally honest, at the end of the day. And so that really speaks to what I believe is a central part in really doing some work in even different states, is that I believe, and you mentioned the word that, what was it, a revolutionary? Revolutionary pioneer. And I do believe that in order for there to be a revolution, there must be an internal revolution. And if we're not willing and courageous enough to be radical internally, to look at what our shortcomings are, because what I've noticed is that the opposition, in my experiences, we've given the opposition way too much power. We've acquiesced a lot of our power to opposition, when the reality is the solutions that can change that lies within us and how we operate and how we deal with people. First of all, it is no small feat that one of the biggest things that, biggest weights that I carried on my shoulder was about the fact that I was an African-American man leading a major movement. That is not something that is like readily accepted in our circles, right? And I carried that weight. And I was like, man, please, God, let me win this, because if I don't, then they'll say, well, that's why people of color can't lead major movements, right? And so even things like that, understanding that there is so much talent, right, and skill set within people who are directly impacted. We talk about keeping people at the center of the movement, right? And we have to do more than just talk about it. We have to do more than just have them be talking heads. But there are people that are closest to the pain that has a skill set and have the capabilities of being at the table devising strategy.
And policy.
Right, and policy.
So speaking of policy, turn to implementation for a
well,
moment.
implementation, outright. So here's the thing, right? We always talk about creating a more inclusive democracy. I'm still in this internal revolution, right? Well, there's two things that we talk about creating a more inclusive democracy, and then one of the things that we always attach to politics is voter registration, right? When we talk about creating a more inclusive democracy, right, we cannot be hypocritical. That means if we want to create a more inclusive democracy, that's for who? Just people that look like me? Or people that might think like me? Because if that's the case, then that's not a more inclusive democracy, right? That means that I have to understand that every able-bodied citizen should have their voices heard, and I should do everything within my power to make sure that that happens, because I believe that a more inclusive democracy creates a more vibrant one, and a vibrant democracy is good for everybody. So that right there helps orient me that know that, listen, I have to make sure that I am being radical enough to say that everybody should have a say. But now here's the other part. What we've done, and I think that could use a little adjustment, is that our first encounter with voters have traditionally been transactional. We just, when we won, there were so many people that was calling, asking for a list of felons because we want to register felons. And I tell you what, it really started irritating the hell out of me because it felt like I had a target on my back. And it went against what the campaign was about, because people were looking for felons, it reduced my humanity to being nothing but a token, nothing but another vote in some partisan war, right? And that's not how you want to interact with people for the first time when you talk about voting. That they're nothing but a vote, they're nothing but a token, and so we have to change the way we think and get. I think we get more what we call transformational encounters. That's what we seek, because we believe that, and we showed it in Amendment 4, that I can talk to anybody right? And I could really respect their humanity and respect their needs, right? And speak to them, not ignore them and just only speak to my kind of people, but I speak to everyone. And in doing so, we were able to pull over a million. Just think about that. The gubernatorial election was decided by 30,000, a congressional election by about 10,000, presidential election by 100,000. We pulled 1 million people who we were traditionally thought would not vote for us, would be against us. Over 1 million of them said yes on 4, right? We meet people where they're at.
Doesn't mean that is a powerful point to end on. Thank you so much for your time
Thank you
this
for having
morning,
me.
and thanks again to all of you.
Please welcome the film's director, Rudy Valdez, with The Atlantic's deputy editor, Jillian White.
Whew. I personally could have used a few more seconds to get myself together, but...
Yeah, the film's not as funny as I remember it being.
Rudy, I'm so happy to be here with you, and I think this is the perfect capstone to this particular event, because I think what we're trying to do here is not just talk about the numbers, which I think a lot of people have gotten caught up with when it comes to incarceration, because in fact the numbers are so staggering that sometimes there's really not a will to go beyond them. You know, you say the number 1 and 2, that itself is a mic drop, but you say 1 and 2, and then you ask people to raise their hands, and it is a completely different experience. And I think the reason your film is so affecting for so many people, myself included, is because the experience of having a loved one who is incarcerated for such a long time was so lonely, which is nuts when you think about how many people are actually affected by it. So I was wondering if you could talk a little about the point where the films that you were taking, the videos you were taking, went from being something just for Cindy to something much bigger than that.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. This is amazing. It's always amazing to come into a room and see people, you know, involved in this and wanting to fight this fight. You know, when you read about my film, you see on paper that I made it over the course of a decade. And I always start there because, you know, on paper I did make it over the course of a decade. I started filming the day after my sister went away. But I always go back to the day before, February 29th, 2008, because it was there that I realized that, you know, while this film took me a decade, it was something that was burning in me for a very long time. You know, I grew up feeling very underrepresented, like I didn't have a voice, like my community was overlooked, my family was overlooked. And I remember sitting in that courtroom that day and them saying that she's going away for 15 years, and these federal marshals come down the aisle and they take her away, and I'm looking around and I have that feeling that I'd had so long in my life, is thinking, who's going to say something? Who's going to help? And I'm looking around and I realized right then that nobody's coming. Nobody's going to help. And I didn't know what it meant at that point, but I knew that I had to fight. And I didn't know what that was going to be, but the next day I went to my sister's house, and her daughters were there. Just, you know, her daughters were, you know, 4, 2, and 6 weeks old at the time. And I didn't know what to do, and I knew that I was going to fight, and I was going to do everything I could to try and get her out. But in the meantime, she wasn't going to see them grow up. And there happened to be a little handy cam that Cindy always had around, and I picked it up and I just started filming the girls, because I thought at the very least I can try and allow her to watch them grow up. You know, I knew that she would have phone calls and letters, but I wanted her to see them live. And so I started doing that, and I was living in New York City at the time, and I would fly back whenever I could, and for birthdays or special events and things like that. And you know, the moment that this turned into a documentary was actually the scene that you just watched. It's the opening scene in the film for a reason. You know, I distinctly remember, again, living in New York City, having about $540 in my bank account, and the round-trip ticket back to Michigan was $380, but it was Autumn's first dance recital, her oldest daughter, and I said, I have to be there. I have to go and film this. Cindy's going to want to see this, and she's going to want to see it filmed by a family member. She's going to want to see her getting ready. So I'm just there filming Autumn getting ready, and Cindy calls completely organically, and she says that line, do you know what Mommy's going to do while you go to dance? I'm going to lay down in my bed, I'm going to close my eyes, and I'm going to think about you. In that moment, it changed everything, because I realized that I had an opportunity to tell a story that you don't normally get to see. The ramifications of these long sentences, the people left behind, and I was going to be able to tell the story from the inside out. And that I quit everything. I was a teacher, I was an actor, I was a writer, I was doing a lot of other things, and I quit everything. And I said in that moment, I was like, I'm going to tell this story, I'm going to make this film, and I had no idea what that meant. But I went back to New York, and I started, you know, making calls and trying to introduce myself to people, and I started PAing and working on everybody else's film so that I could figure out how to do this, how to make this story, and I dedicated my life to documentary film. And this film was my film school. And that's how it all sort of started.
Yeah. Can we go back to one of those first scenes? I noticed that when your nieces are talking to you, they say, "Are you sad that she's somewhere far away?" Yeah. Is that what you guys told them about where she was, or did they just not really understand?
No, that's one of the things I'll always credit Cindy for. She never lied about where she was or what was going on. She's asking if I'm sad that she's far away because it was literally an 8-hour drive to see her when they were going to see her. And so she knew the reason she could only see her at that point every 6 weeks or 8 weeks was because it was an 8-hour drive and it was expensive and so she was hurting. Like, that question is really why she's sad. She's sad because mommy's far away and she can't go and see her and she can't hug her whenever she wants. So, that's where that question stemmed from. So yeah, no, they were always, especially Autumn, the oldest, was always very informed about what was happening.
Did their understanding or reaction to the fact that their mom was incarcerated change over time? As you said, she was gone for 9 years. They were obviously very small when she left and then had to grow up kind of in the shadow of that. How did their feelings or thoughts about the situation change as they grew?
It's interesting because Autumn, we've talked about this since the films come out and all these things. Autumn certainly changed throughout the process. For the younger two girls, Anna was 6 weeks old, so she didn't know anything else. Her mother was a phone, and this person that she would go and visit, every few weeks, or at one time when she was moved to Florida, once a year. So she was this disconnected, person. Ava, was too young to really remember mommy being home, and I remember Autumn asking her about how she felt about a lot of this. And she said to me, because she changed, and you see it if you watch the film. Please watch the film. If you watch the film, she's this young, like, precocious, articulate, very bubbly, outspoken kid. And then as she grows older, you see this sort of the weight of the world bearing down on her. And at the end, we talk about statistics in films and things like that. And I decided when we started to edit this film that I was not going to have a single stat card in this film. There's not one stat in this entire film. And my producers and editors at the beginning were like, let's pause before we make that statement. And I said, no, I will not have a single stat card in this film. And they said, why? And I said, well, let me show you. And so we went through the editing process, and I refused to put a single stat card. And they're watching one of the first cuts, and there's a scene at the end where Cindy's oldest daughter, Autumn, looks up at the camera, and she says, "Hi, I'm Autumn, and I'm 13 years old." And you see what this time has done to her. You see on her face what time away from her mother has done to her and the weight of the world on her shoulders. And I said, that's why we don't need a stat card, because we have a human face that we can put on this. And that's going to carry on longer than any stat when somebody leaves this film. So, when you ask about how they were, it's a tough question to answer because we still don't know. Yeah. They were affected throughout this process, but, they had their mother away for 9.5 years. And it's long lasting. These effects are going to affect them for a very long time. So it's been a long process for them. And it's tough to even say how they've changed because it's been such the norm for them for so long.
I want to let our audience know that we will be coming to you for questions. I just have a few more questions for Rudy. So if you do have questions, get those hands up. We have mic runners in the aisles.
No math question.
So by some accounts, Cindy was actually pretty lucky. She was one of, I believe, 1,600 people who had their sentences cut short out of something like 36,000 who were eligible. I'm wondering what you think contributed to that, and then also what Cindy's feeling was coming out and realizing that she was one of very few.
Yeah. So you're asking what attributed to her being?
Yeah.
That's a very difficult question to answer because I do not know. Yeah. Many of you who've gone through this process or are in this process know it is not a transparent thing. People, I can't tell you how many emails that I've received saying, "How did you do it?" And I keep telling people, I don't know how I did it. The only thing that I know that I actively did or that we did it as a family was I played the long game. As you can see, it took me 10 years to make this film. I played the long game in a lot of things, and I looked at when I realized finally that it wasn't a clerical error, that she was going to be in prison for 15 years, I looked at what that 15 years looked like, what the process was, and all the milestones that we had to hit for her possibly getting some sort of relief. And I saw these first couple appeals and this third appeal, and then way down the road, 9.5 years down the road, I saw clemency. Like, that's something that, if none of this works, that's a possibility. And I said, well, I'm going to get started on that now. Yeah. And so I was living in New York, and anytime there was a hearing or a rally, and I worked with FAM a lot throughout this process, anytime there was anything going on, I would drive to DC, most of the time not invited, and just walk into these places, and I would talk to every single person who would talk to me. And I would say Cindy's full name. I would tell her story. I would never say her or she. I would say Cynthia Shank, Cynthia Shank, Cynthia Shank. And I took page 1 of the political handbook and I said, name recognition. I want people to recognize her name, because at some point, if I talk to enough people and they hear her story, 8 years down the road, 9 years down the road, I'm going to write this petition. And my hope is whoever's desk that's going across is going to look at that name and say, Cynthia Shank, I know that name, and open up that folder, because I knew if I could get them to open up that folder and read that she had a chance. And it's bittersweet, because throughout that decade of doing this, I met so many families, so many people who, if people opened up that folder and read their story and read why they were there, that they would have a chance. And unfortunately, I think so many people's stories and so many people's petitions just aren't read. You know, it's such a, there's so many to go through, and I don't know what put my sisters through. I'll probably never know, but it's certainly something that's bittersweet. And you know, and if you watch the film, I hope you watch the film. If you watch the film, we talked to Cindy about that, you know, and because she was fresh home, she didn't know the odds. She knew the odds, but she didn't know how many people had come home and how many people were not going to come home. And I sort of broke the news to her, and she has this like 2-second moment of sort of relief, and I talked to her about this later, because she has this complete turn, because it hits her, all of the people that are still there, that are left behind, that are just as deserving as her, if not more, to be home with their families.
I have one more question for you before we go to the audience. As we've heard before, and I think as we know, release is the first step, and often after that, there is not a lot of help for kind of reintegrating into your life. What is Cindy's life like now?
Again, like we had mentioned earlier, Cindy is sort of a best case scenario in a lot of ways. She had a family that is helping her emotionally, financially, in every way possible, and it still was completely, I don't know how people don't go back when they come home. I have no idea how a person without resources doesn't head directly back into prison, because even with all of these the benefits that she had of a family supporting her and a place to go and not having to worry about paying a bill right when she gets home, it was difficult. You know, she was asked to go and report to a place 3 hours away, and they were like, if you don't report, then it's sort of, then you're going to have to go back to the halfway house, and you're going to have to do all these things. And if she didn't have a car, it was a 3-hour drive, it would have been a 6-hour bus ride. And if you don't have them, she left prison with $45, and they clipped her license in half when she left. Like, I don't know what, because she did a program and earned her CDL there. She was like, well, maybe I can do something with this. And they literally, as she was leaving, one of the first things she showed me when she got in the car was, they clipped my license in half. And I was like, well, why'd they do that? She said, they said it was expired. And it doesn't expire for 5 years, you know, but they clip it. And she's like, I have a check. She was like, how do I cash this check? Like, you know, and luckily we were there to pick her up. Like, I don't know what people do. And somebody had talked earlier about shame. You know, one of the things that she was forced to do when she came home, because she was on home confinement for 2 months, anywhere she went, she had to go in and talk to the manager of the place or the highest ranking person at the place and say, hi, I'm a felon on home confinement, and I need you to sign this to prove that I was here, because I have to turn in this timesheet. And, you know, I remember her wanting to go have breakfast with my father at this place that he loves to go to, and he was so excited, and his friend owns the place, and they sat down, and she had to go to his friend and say, "Hi, could you please sign this? I'm a felon, I just got home from prison." And she wasn't ashamed, and my father, you know, that everyone knew what was going on, but still, like that constant reminder that you are other, you are less than, and you have to have to continue to prove yourself to us. And I always talk about shame because I feel like incarcerated individuals and families of incarcerated individuals and communities with high populations of incarcerated individuals have this shame or stigma about them, and I feel like that has to shift, and some of this shame and stigma has to go on this system that is perpetuating this. They should share some of this shame. So it's difficult coming home.
Yeah. Do we have any audience questions? I think we have one back there.
Hi, my name is Emma Coleman. I work with the nonprofit Hope House, and I facilitate a parenting class in FCI Cumberland with dads whose children live in DC. And one of the things that the dads struggle with the most is answering the question, especially from their younger children, of when are you coming home? And I was wondering if in any of the observations that you had with Cindy and her kids, how she answered those questions that she might not have a definitive answer for.
I think that she, again, it's difficult, and it was difficult at the time, but she was always 100% honest about when she was coming home. You know, because she would talk to other women in there who would tell their kids, you know, mommy's at college, or mommy's in the army, or mommy's working, and she'll be home in 2 years, and then 2 years passes, and she has to figure out another way to explain why mommy's not home yet. And she said, I never wanted to continue this pain, and I never wanted to make it this slow Band-Aid. That she was always completely honest about the fact that mommy, the way she would explain to them when she was coming home would be life milestones. Like, so Autumn always understood that if mommy does all of her time, she really hopes she'll be home for prom, for her senior prom.
And I think we have one more question right here.
Good morning. Thanks for coming. My name is Olivia. It's very loud. I work on the Senate Small Business Committee, and one of the things that I think about a lot is what can people like me, where we work on policy issues that aren't necessarily always the first thing you think about when you think about criminal justice or social justice, what can we do to help lessen the burden on families like yours going through this reentry process?
I mean, the reentry process, it's interesting because it's actually one of the things that Cindy's trying to do, and it's empowering people who have gone through the process, I think, to help others who are now going through the process, because, I think emotionally, she's now reaching out to people or trying to work with people who are coming home, just because she knows how she was feeling, and there were maybe resources that she could have gone to or she didn't know about. I think preparing somebody for all of the things that are available to them, I think, is the most important, because she didn't really know. And again, she was very lucky because she maybe didn't need these resources as much as other people. But I think that there are a lot of people coming home, and it's, I equate it to a lot of things, like somebody coming home from a war, or somebody, you're back in a population that does not understand what you've just gone through. And you're inundated with all of these options and things and paths, and sometimes it takes somebody else who has gone to war to say, listen, I know what you're going through. This is how we can help you transition. It's in a weird way the simplest thing to think about, but it's also a difficult thing, obviously, to implement. But we have to lean on each other in a lot of ways, and lean on people with like-minded or with similar circumstances.
Yeah. I want to thank Rudy so much for joining us, for sharing your family story. The film is available on HBO still. If you would like to see it, please join me in thanking him.
Thank you, Rudy. I know I'm definitely going to see the film. Thank you, Jillian. Thanks to Matt Thompson and Kathleen Koch and all of our amazing speakers this morning. I'd also like to thank, once again, Forward.us for making everything this morning possible. We're really grateful for your support. And thank you to all of you who are here today. I hope you're leaving feeling inspired and motivated and informed. And before I let you go, I just have one last request, which is that we're going to be sending you an email with a survey about your experience here today. And there's also some hard copies on your tables and around the room. It's just going to take a couple of minutes, but if you don't mind filling it out, it's really helpful to us in shaping our work ahead. Thanks, and have a great day.